in welcoming Steve and Rebecca, I just want to say that last spring, when Mohon Consultations was contemplating this topic, and we were wrestling with how to design this conference that we're having today, and we were struggling with how to bring together these seemingly disparate topics of housing affordability and building more housing and protecting open space. And the question we had was, well, are these topics in conflict? How could we create a dialogue to reveal a forward-looking path? Steve Rosenberg, and Rebecca Gillman Crimmins are the co-conveners of the Hudson Valley Affordable Housing and Conservation Strategy. And I have to say that today's event was in great part informed and inspired by learning about their work to build collaboration between land conservation interests in the Hudson Valley and the affordable housing community as a way to find solutions. So we've heard already a lot about what we need in order to address this issue. We have to understand how we got here. We have to examine the assumptions that we hold. And we have to consider new ways of thinking about affordable housing in our communities. We've heard this already. And in the same breath, again, that same breath, how to mesh that with protection of the open spaces that are so important to life and to our mental and physical health. So you, our speakers, represent a diversity of perspectives and experiences, and we're here today to learn from each other in how to address these questions and to draw on that collective experience, expertise, and vision. And from the Mohon Consultations perspective, our goal is to inform, to inspire, and to foster collaboration. So that being said, I'm going to turn it over to Steve and Rebecca first, and continue the conversation.
Thank you. I'm having the opposite problem. Okay. Thank you, Kara and Mohon Consultations, for organizing today's conference. Clearly a topic that's on the front burner, not just here in the Hudson Valley, but across the country. Thank you to County Executive Metzger for your leadership and your vision, and thank you for sharing your family's personal story. There's so many people that experience housing instability all of the time, and it's important that we hear from those directly impacted so we can shape our lives in action. And thank you to Adam. I think you really set the stage with your data. Costs are up, housing availability is down, and it's leaving few, if any, options for the average household to afford. So as we're getting started here, it would be helpful to know a little bit about all of you. So I'm going to ask a couple of questions. If you want to raise your hands if you feel like your move, this applies to you. So who's involved in land conservation efforts? Wonderful. And who is affordable housing affiliated? Wow. Okay, this is great. And how about our government partners? Wonderful. Economic development? Couple? Okay. Who's not any of these but you're interested? Okay, love it. Great, thank you. So we'd like to start off with a brief note about what brought Steve and I to working together on this project. So a little bit about me. I grew up in the Hudson Valley in Cold Spring in a beautiful setting with access to the outdoors and transit in a community that many of you know has become increasingly unaffordable, certainly in my lifetime. In my day job, I work for a nonprofit that provides social services and a housing organization called the Institute for Community Living, and I develop affordable and supportive housing. And before that, I worked for the State Housing Financing Agency, where we financed affordable housing across the state, and was always noticing how few projects we did in the Hudson Valley, and it was a noticeable gap. Steve grew up in rapidly developing South Florida in the 60s and 70s, practiced real estate and land use law in Washington, D.C., and then led Scenic Hudson's Land Trust and other programs for many years, and served on the board of the Land Trust Alliance for 9 years. He's been interested in these issues for some time and founded his town of Rhinebeck's Open Space and Affordable Housing Committee back in 2006. So why did we create this process, and why these groups, why now? With Steve and I coming from the other sector, we have a shared understanding that a healthy region needs both ample housing options that people can afford and a healthy climate resilient environment. But unfortunately, the two sectors typically work in ways that are mutually exclusive or worse, at times opposed to one another. We saw an opportunity in the converging interests by conservation and affordable housing groups in addressing the climate crisis and issues of racial and economic justice. So we set out to create a strategy to bridge the gap between the two sectors. There was a new sense of urgency during and coming out of the pandemic to address and solve these big issues, and to question how we've been doing business before. And this moment was a catalyst to bring us all together and to try something new. The conservation and affordable housing sectors both depend on land and on local support to do their work. They have a tremendous amount in common. They don't have to be separate or at odds. The solutions to one don't need to exclude the other. And as a region, we can't afford for them to. So the Hudson Valley Affordable Housing and Conservation Strategy is a group of 10 nonprofits, 5 conservation land trusts, and 5 affordable housing organizations, many represented here today. For those participants, do you want to raise your hand so people can see who you are? Wonderful. Thank you. So these groups believe that healthy communities need both abundant affordable housing and protected land that supports clean water, food production, climate resilience, and outdoor access. The groups work across 6 counties in urban, suburban, and rural settings, and include Putnam, Dutchess, Columbia, Greene, Ulster, and Orange counties. We began convening the groups and launched the project in July of 2022. This project really hits close to home for a lot of the groups because their staff members struggle to find housing that they can afford in the area, as many others do. And similarly, many are drawn to the region because of the incredible access to nature and the outdoors. We started the process by building relationships and are committed to continuing to grow trust across these sectors. One of the first eye-openers for us was how much overlap there is in the group's mission statement, as you can see in the grid map. From there, the groups drafted a statement of their shared values, generated policy ideas to advance common goals, and they map communities where the conditions may be conducive to real-life projects to begin to demonstrate what's possible. To support this work, facilitation and project management is being provided by the Consensus Building Institute, with Regional Plan Association providing GIS and technical assistance, including fiscal sponsorship. The Columbia Land Conservancy is also a fiscal sponsor of our efforts. The project has received generous financial support from a variety of sources, including a number of individuals, the New York State Conservation Partnership Program of the New York State DEC and the Land Trust Alliance, the JPB Foundation, the Nature Conservancy of New York, and very importantly, all 10 participating organizations. So before we go further, let's step back and talk about what is affordable housing and who is it for. Affordable housing is for people of a variety of incomes. We all know and care about people who need affordable housing. Housing is considered affordable when a resident pays 30% of their income towards rent. This is a standard that is set by the federal government. With that said, what is affordable to someone making $80,000 a year is clearly not the same as housing affordable to people that make $30,000 a year. According to the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, a worker earning the minimum wage in New York State at $14.20 an hour would have to work 98 hours a week, okay? 98 hours a week to afford the average rental home at $18.11 a month. For many people across the state, this is simply out of reach. It is certainly unaffordable to seniors on fixed incomes and increasingly more and more people with full-time jobs. Another question that comes up frequently is who qualifies for affordable housing. Eligibility is linked to area median income, which is called AMI, For example, a senior with only Social Security income is below 30% of AMI. A single parent who works in a grocery store or restaurant making minimum wage with one kid, let's say they get $15 an hour and they always work a steady 40 hours a week, they're a little bit below 40% AMI. Or a single teacher early in their career making about 50 grand, that's below 80% of AMI. All of these people qualify for subsidized affordable housing and have very few, if any, housing options in the traditional market. There are innumerable physical and mental health benefits to having quality, safe, stable, affordable housing, ideally with access to services and shopping. Similarly, opportunities to enjoy access to the outdoors improves well-being, and projects that are able to include both affordable housing and open space components meet a spectrum of human needs and push back against stereotypes of what subsidized housing looks like. When many people hear the phrase affordable housing, there are connotations and potentially bias that come up, images of old school towers in the park development, rather than the high quality design prevalent in affordable housing today. Affordable housing goes through design review by the financing agency and often is reviewed during a local planning process. Affordable housing is often the most energy efficient project around. That's because there are more rules that apply to affordable housing. And all state-financed affordable housing is required to be high performance, all electric, and we're moving towards a goal of being carbon neutral. This goes far beyond what building codes require and means they're nearly always more efficient than local market housing rate options. Additionally, the development is usually compact and located in or adjacent to existing town or village centers. So that takes the pressure off the countryside and developing more and more greenfields. It also includes the adaptive reuse of existing buildings. Affordable housing development is a climate-smart solution. These developments adhere to smart growth principles, high energy efficiency standards, provide better indoor air quality, prioritize resident comfort, and reduce the cost to operate buildings. Over the last year and a half working and learning together, the housing and conservation groups have agreed that it does not diminish the efforts of conservation groups to support affordable housing in the communities where they work, nor does it take away from any affordable housing efforts to support conservation work. Collaboration is the way forward. We can accomplish more working together than we can separately, and the day ahead promises important discussions about our region's future. Our goal is to set the stage for these discussions, share some thoughts about where we are now, how we got here, and suggest some new directions to think about as we hear from others across the region doing this work.
Thank you, Rebecca. So I'm Steve Rosenberg. I'm going to continue on here, and I also just want to say good morning and thank you to Kara and to Moham Consultations, to County Executive Metzger, and to Adam for your wonderful comments from Pattern. The Hudson Valley has been at the forefront of many nationally significant events and trends, from the Hudson River School of Art, when we began to grapple with the growing nation's relationship with and impact on the American landscape, to its role in the nation's commercial and industrial might, to the birth of the modern environmental movement in the 1960s with the battle to save Storm King Mountain. Now we have an opportunity to embark on a course-shifting effort together as a region to demonstrate strategies to address two of today's most pressing challenges. But first, we've got to acknowledge some of the realities. Communities everywhere are struggling to respond, and we're going to hear this over and over again, to the crisis level, I'm going to emphasize crisis level need for housing that most people can afford. And at the same time, many communities in our region are working to protect their open spaces and farmland, and most importantly, combat the climate crisis. Hardly a day goes by without a major media report, opinion piece, or policy proposal about these issues. It doesn't seem controversial to say that a vibrant, sustainable region needs both. But we're all here because figuring out how to get there has proved more challenging than anyone can imagine. It comes as a surprise to many that conservation and affordable housing sector's goals are remarkably well aligned, perhaps no more so than in addressing the climate crisis. But unfortunately, many people have come to view the two through the narrow frame of having to choose between being pro-development or pro-environment. The Hudson Valley has a proud, if not unparalleled, tradition of support for land conservation. Land trusts are active in most every community and at the regional level. And the national conservation organizations work here as well, not to mention the state and federal agencies that support these efforts. The groups know each other well, and they've collaborated on projects and policy initiatives for years. In many Hudson Valley towns, significant amounts of farmland have been protected from sprawling subdivisions, ecologically sensitive tracts have been saved, and parks and preserves have been created. It didn't just happen. It's taken decades of concerted, strategic effort and advocacy. And in the face of the climate crisis and an increasingly fragmented rural landscape, there's still very much more to do. New York State's Climate Forward 30 by 30 policy, for example, has set a goal of conserving 30% of the state's land and waters by 2030. And that means conserving a lot more land in the Hudson Valley in the next 16 years. There are also examples of affordable housing projects that housing groups have been able to complete, admittedly, often only after years of controversy. These require years of planning and approvals, cobbling together multiple funding sources, construction, and finally, thankfully, welcoming residents to their homes. The initial reaction to affordable housing projects is usually mixed at best, whereas the reaction to open space conservation is often more widely supported. For a number of reasons, the affordable housing sector has not had the same level of resources and public support as the conservation sector. And the speed at which affordable units are being built is simply not meeting the region's urgent housing needs. As years and then decades have passed, and as our rural economies have changed, communities have become more exclusive. Land and housing prices have risen. The size of houses has grown, even as Adam told us, the size of households has shrunk. And the supply of housing that most people can afford hasn't come close to meeting the demand. Both rental options and home ownership increasingly are out of reach. The people who work in the jobs we all rely on for the functioning and quality of life in our communities, schools, trades, farms, hospitals, nonprofits, local government services, and the stores and restaurants we all frequent have few, if any, housing options they can afford. Mixed income communities are important. There are hidden but very real costs to the increasing homogeneity that comes with the loss of economic diversity in our communities. Having fewer opportunities for shared experiences across socioeconomic sectors results in loss of sense of community, and with it, the loss of meaningful civic engagement. Issues like affordable housing become even more intractable as the need becomes so widespread that no one community can address it at scale. And then small incremental efforts to create more affordable housing may not receive the support they deserve because they aren't seen as being significant enough to move the needle. Neighbors don't often grasp the severity and scale of the housing crisis, or become alarmed about the perceived impacts of new affordable housing projects on their quality of life or their property values at a hyper-local scale, when in fact a broader perspective is what we need. The most highly charged word, County Executive Metzger mentioned this earlier, in land use conversations today is NIMBY. People are highly sensitive about being characterized as one. I've never met a person who admitted to being one, although Rebecca told me she has. When the groups participating in our project were developing their shared value statement, the most challenging conversation they had was how to capture the concept of NIMBY without stigmatizing or alienating anyone in their organizations. A similar dynamic of people focusing at a hyper-local scale rather than the bigger picture arises when it comes to conservation, and in particular when addressing the climate crisis. Many people believe that the solutions need to happen at a higher structural level because they say one person's or one family's actions won't really make a dent. Yet when state or national policy incentivizes solutions like solar on a larger scale, we often see opposition to specific projects, always on very principled grounds when they're located nearby. Granted, the devil's in the details, but too often a community's knee-jerk opposition focused on narrow site-specific issues doesn't adequately consider the greater benefits that will accrue to their community or to the larger region. The fact is that smart growth, affordable housing solutions are also effective climate solutions. Yet similarly, when projects are proposed, even in or next to existing village or town centers, already served by infrastructure, near parks, schools, and jobs, and which reduce the need for driving, the same sort of opposition arises. Again, often focused on narrow, sometimes parochial concerns. One of the most frequently prescribed solutions to the affordable housing crisis targets local zoning that permits only single-family homes, and that makes it virtually illegal to build just the kind of mixed-income neighborhoods we need. We must fix this. But oh, can it be difficult to change decades of established zoning policy to encourage a more diverse and efficient mix of housing types. Many of our communities once had a mix of housing types, but now are dominated by higher-priced single-family homes rather than larger homes split into duplexes or having garage apartments, which provide more affordable options. And this is really important for us as a region, knowing that literally millions of people will need to relocate away from vulnerable locations due to sea level rise and storm events. How do we make good on our shared responsibility to identify new places where they can live? There was also Governor Hochul's proposed housing compact, which was the first time a governor attempted to approach land use policy at the state level to address the housing crisis. Ultimately unsuccessful, and not without its shortcomings, the vitriol it provoked is symptomatic of the challenges at the heart of the discussions today. The goal of the housing compact was to ensure that communities across the state committed to identifying places for growth and to provide clear pathways and shorter timelines for development. Unfortunately, the policy was fast-tracked and people were more inclined to react than to engage constructively. It also could have prioritized affordable housing development more, and concerns around weakened environmental review and the potential for new housing to be in vulnerable locations needed to be addressed. There's another phenomenon in the Hudson Valley that's at play sometimes as well, increasingly so as Hudson Valley real estate values have moved upward, which is to treat the region less as a dynamic, adaptable place to live, and more as a thing that should be curated, as if an object in a museum, or where each square inch is defended as if it's somehow sacrosanct and guaranteed to be insulated against any external change for all time. We can lose our ability to see the smarter, greener forest through the trees just outside our window. Again, we don't always have the perspective we need to succeed at a regional scale. Making these challenges, this is a downer, I know. Making these challenges even greater, too often the perception and the reality is that the conservation and affordable housing sectors are mutually exclusive, or worse, opposed to one another. And unfortunately, public programs and private philanthropy have tended to reinforce the siloed nature of each. Public programs will pay to conserve only entire tracts, even when portions of the property may be particularly well suited for affordable housing. Other programs will subsidize affordable housing units, but not other elements needed to create a truly healthy living environment, including quality open space. Don't get me wrong. The region's immense ecological, historic, scenic, and cultural assets are still intact today because because of a fierce commitment of so many for so long. And for this we should all be proud. But when we look back on the 21st century, or our children look back on the 21st century, will our efforts be viewed as successful if we continue to promote only all or nothing outcomes? If we freeze the region in time, except for single-family homes on large lots, of course. But if we haven't addressed the region's greatest challenges. We have to acknowledge that we haven't been successful enough as a region in addressing the large pressing needs of affordable housing, where the approach has been primarily opportunistic, one-off projects, or on truly strategic land conservation, conserving the most important conservation areas and connectors, and also supporting well-planned development in appropriate locations. We can and need to do more to break out of these silos and adopt a less binary approach. As one example, the alignment of conservation and affordable housing groups' goals around smarter land use and climate also point to new, more holistic ways of communicating with their supporters. And I think someone spoke about perceptions earlier. Communications by the people in this room to the people who they talk to, tremendously important. I'm oversimplifying, but conservation and housing groups' newsletters and social media posts typically share their latest victories, and I'm not minimizing those, a parcel saved or a new preserve created if a land trust, new dwelling units available, or under construction if a housing group. But in order to educate and inform people about the multiple things the region needs that depend on land, these groups will need to start communicating in positive terms about more than just their own projects. Be they affordable units, a critical habitat conserve, or a community solar project. We can't keep talking about affordable housing and conservation in isolation from the other, when both are needed to create a healthier, more sustainable region. After all, we are the people who are supposed to understand that everything is connected to everything else. So how did we get here? Take a deep breath, everyone. I'm going. It's not news that when many people experience the Hudson Valley for the first time, they're amazed that such a beautiful place exists so close to New York City. So with many people long ago priced out of Long Island, New Jersey, Westchester, and Rockland, the successive waves of 9/11, Hurricanes Irene and Sandy, yes, Chelsea Clinton's wedding, the ability to telecommute, and COVID made the Hudson Valley a very real option for people seeking greener, less expensive pastures. Not that many years ago, the places some now think of as just having been discovered and brought back to life were in a very different condition. Our small cities in particular had suffered a series of setbacks. Urban renewal displacing entire communities, mostly people of color. The loss of manufacturing jobs. Industrial pollution degrading neglected post-industrial waterfronts. Suburban flight and broad urban disinvestment. Many of Beacon's Main Street storefronts were boarded up. Newburgh had been divided by urban renewal and the loss of industry. Kingston was struggling to regain its footing after IBM closed its manufacturing plant in 1994, and Hudson was not at all the destination for hip New Yorkers that it is today. The cities were all searching for new economic engines to heal these wounds. And the suburban enclaves and strip malls that grew up during the IBM era, outside of Poughkeepsie and Kingston, provided housing and comfort for many, mostly white families, but also became what some saw as sprawl and what was eating up the countryside, the antithesis of smart growth, and became a rallying cry for some of what the rest of the Hudson Valley should not become. In many ways, our riverfront cities today represent remarkable stories of urban revitalization and economic rebirth. New businesses have been created, and people are moving to them instead of away from them. But this dynamic also has resulted in displacement and division. And now we must ask how our cities and villages can grow and evolve without further displacement, while preserving their existing affordable housing stock and adapting older buildings into affordable housing, and while ensuring that both new and existing residents have access to healthy, climate-resilient environments. How can this newfound prosperity and opportunity be shared by all residents? A corollary to the transformation of the river cities has been taking place in our rural areas. In the 1990s, rural communities were facing great economic uncertainty, and the fate of Hudson Valley farms was far from secure, not that it's exactly a shoe-in today. This wasn't so much because of rising land prices, but because the region's small, family-run farms had a hard time competing with big ag. Their next generation didn't see a future in farming, and farmers felt threatened by new proposed environmental regulations. Our rural villages and hamlets could no longer rely on their traditional economic drivers. Farm to table wasn't a thing. Microbreweries were nowhere to be found. A food truck was a large semi-trailer delivering chicken to Stop and Shop. No one had uttered the words farming and climate in the same sentence. And land trusts and government weren't yet paying farmers to keep their land open and available for food production. Today, many are reaping the benefits of these changes to the rural and agricultural economic ecosystem. But at the same time, farmers, farm workers, and others who contribute to our rural communities can't find an affordable place to live. High land values are making it harder for farmers to compete with mini estates and large lot subdivisions as land use. And farming is just as hard as it ever was, if not more so, as the climate continues to change. So while overall the Hudson Valley is no longer seen as distress, this prosperity has not been shared equally. New economic opportunities have been created, which have benefited many, and that's great. Yet the region has become a place that is marketed as an upscale experience, where the highest value proposition sometimes can be to protect not the environment for the greater public, but the high quality of life this transformation has made possible for some. Instead, we need to leverage conservation and affordable housing goals to create the dynamic, climate-forward, mixed-income communities the region urgently needs.
Thanks, Steve, for walking us through how we got here today. I'm going to talk a little bit about the way forward. There's a lot of heavy stuff, but that's what we're grappling with as we think about the next decades here. So the region has undergone a lot of turnarounds, but everything hasn't gone right to ensure that we have the housing and the environment that people need and deserve. The current state of affairs just isn't acceptable, but that doesn't have to determine our future. How do we respond as a Hudson Valley region to increasing inequality and climate change? Our response to the climate crisis points to a path for the future. Currently, too many people live in vulnerable locations. Rural sprawl are fragmenting the landscape and challenging the viability of our farms. With all that said, one of the great things about the Hudson Valley is that we have a track record of pulling together to accomplish remarkable things, especially in the realm of the valley's environment, history, and culture. To name a few, the Hudson River Valley Greenway, the Hudson River Valley National Heritage Area, the Estuary Program, and the transformations of many formerly neglected and contaminated urban waterfronts that have transformed to welcoming gateways on the Hudson, such as in Beacon, Kingston, and Cold Spring, to name a few. And now it's time for us to do it again. The convergence of the public's interest in addressing conservation, climate change, and affordable housing, I mean, look how many of you are here today to talk about this, presents an opportunity to think and act in different ways. So now I'm going to go through a list of strategies that we'll offer to consider as the day unfolds. First, affordable housing and conservation groups need to support one another and collaborate to build stronger communities. These collaborations leverage each other's relationships, resources, and skill sets to advance projects. The unique collaboration among 10 land trusts and affordable housing groups is ushering in new ways of communicating and getting things done, where each project isn't framed as an all-or-nothing, one-size-fits-all proposition, and where more can be gained through collaboration. For example, recently a participating housing group sought feedback from a participating land trust to understand what part of a site it would be better to build on and what area was more ecologically sensitive. Demonstrating that our vision of a healthy region includes both goals, earlier this year, Scenic Hudson honored REPCO's important work at its annual gala. Representation on each other's boards and committees. Let's see our land trusts and affordable housing groups include representatives from the other sector, such as Columbia County Habitat inviting a Columbia Land Conservancy staffer to join their site selection committee. Creating more community land trusts that will develop and protect affordable housing and open space long-term. These efforts are already underway with some of our participating organizations, including Taproot in Kingston and in Trillium in Columbia County. You'll be hearing more about that today. Second, affordable housing groups and land trusts need to work with local and county governments that want to partner or lead on these issues. In Red Hook, we'll hear more later from Town Supervisor Robert McEwen. Three groups, REPCO, Scenic Hudson, and Dutchess Land Conservancy, are working with the town to both conserve 100 acres of farmland and to create about 40 new affordable housing units on the edge of the village. Land trusts and affordable housing groups can share ideas and proposals with local officials together as a team, giving the officials more confidence in advancing these goals and affordable housing projects in particular. Third, we have to ensure that local land use policy identifies places for multifamily housing and prioritizes smart growth and the protection of critical environmental resources. Conservation groups and public agencies use sophisticated analytical tools to identify the most important places to conserve. Instead of creating separate open space and affordable housing development strategies, let's create integrated municipal open space and affordable housing plans that truly embrace smart growth principles and proactively direct development. Communities must adapt and update their comprehensive plans and zoning to enable the construction of climate-smart, multifamily, and that missing middle housing that Steve referenced earlier. Land trusts and affordable housing groups can break out of their usual silos by stepping up to offer positive public comments on new plans and the zoning to advance these goals. Fourth, we need to advocate for state policy that supports accomplishing both of these goals in tandem. We need to work with our state and local officials to enable, if not incentivize, municipalities to adopt dual community preservation and community housing funds. Last year on the east end of Long Island, for the first time, the voters in several towns that already have community preservation funds adopted a 0.5% transfer fee to support municipal affordable housing efforts. We also must reform state conservation and affordable housing funding programs so that they can prioritize and advance both of these goals. Fifth, we need to encourage private philanthropy to support these efforts. Land trusts and affordable housing leaders fear losing support from their existing funders and board members. Through conversations and learning, we're communicating that the two are mutually supportive. We also believe that there's a growing pool of funders and board members who see the bigger picture and prefer to support groups that work more collaboratively to achieve more. And finally, we need to debunk the myths that created the current state of affairs. People need to know that affordable housing is sustainable, energy efficient, and it's a contributor to community vitality. It's not a burden. Housing and conservation groups need to communicate differently to their boards and constituents. talking about smart growth, affordable housing, and the climate as part of a more holistic approach to building a healthier, more sustainable region, and to begin to change the narrative from no to yes. There's an amazing group of people here today in this room, and everyone here cares so deeply about this region, and you're working tirelessly to make it an incredible place to live. So we are all the people to do this. We're the right people, and this is the right time. So let's join together and shape the future of the region for the next century to come. If you're interested in staying in touch with our project, there'll be a survey sent out by Mohawk Consultations. You can sign up for some email updates, join us at the networking session, and thank you to Mohawk Consultations and to all of you for being here and listening. And now I'll have some time for some questions.
Thank you. We do have time for just a small handful of questions. Before we start that, I'll just ask the panel, the first panel, to get ready to come up so that we can do that before lunch. So we'll take questions from the floor, right here.
Yeah, Mike Baden, Town Supervisor, Town of Rochester. One of the things that I see and hear often is there's stigmas involved with terminology. The word affordable housing, to many people, has a real stigma attached to what that means, both to the general population and the people who are looking for that as well. And so the terminology of workforce housing has helped change that a little bit, but I realize that they're two very different things. So what tools and how do we get the message out that affordable housing is about real people and the people in the community and not a stereotypical person that's attached to the name?
I think we talk about it that way. I think we have to talk about everything needs to be humanized. I think everything has become very, if you talk about it conceptually, you're not hurting anybody. But it's not conceptual, right? These are very real things. If you ask somebody, oh, can you afford the $500,000 house that is, around the corner from where you live and you'd like to buy it, but you can't. Like, these are very tangible issues. So I think as much as grounding it and talking to people and sharing examples, so sharing the examples of the types, not the type, but the types of households that actually do benefit, I think is helpful in talking about who needs it, because it is a lot of people. I also just say workforce housing, to me, maybe others in the room think differently, doesn't actually mean anything specific. It's a phrase that is used instead of affordable housing, but it doesn't have, there's no area median income definition that goes along with workforce housing. So, yeah, I mean, so there's different types of affordable housing. If you're talking about sort of the biggest bucket in the country, we have the low-income housing tax credit, and that is affordable to households at or below 80% of the area median income. So I think that's a sort of good, broad definition. That includes a lot of people.
I think another part of the answer to your question is, who is the messenger? Who are those people talking to, and what are they hearing back from them? And I think in the Hudson Valley, whether it's Rochester or lots of other communities, there are people, many of them in this room, who have been for years active in the conservation movement. And if they start speaking and local officials start speaking differently, knowing they'll be defended by others about affordable housing as not something to be stigmatized, but something that our community needs, neighbor to neighbor, that can begin to change the conversation.
Hey Mike, just one other thing real quick. Having worked in communications my whole life, this is a really hard thing to communicate on a macro level. If you can get down, like I went and met with my town housing committee in Saugerties for an hour and a half one night. And it took that time to explain to them that what's affordable to me is different than what's affordable to my parents, and that's different from what's affordable for someone who works at Lots of Bagels or some local business, right? And that having that affordability across the entire spectrum means, yeah, we need single-family homes and apartments, but we also need shared equity co-ops and housing that's on a community land trust and townhouses and that full spectrum, because Affordable means something different to the full spectrum of people, and therefore it looks different when you think about the full spectrum of housing. And I feel like digging in and talking about that helps people understand it better, but it's practically impossible to do at the macro level from a real good communication standpoint.
Let's take one more question.
I really appreciated the way you described how we need to urbanize and save land, but at the same time, how that, evokes attention within those communities as we come in. And I haven't heard a lot about condominium and co-op conversion. As you guys may be aware, that's nested within the AG's office. Oftentimes it can cost anywhere from $40,000 to $60,000 to effectuate a condominium conversion. Now in cities like Newburgh, Kingston, Poughkeepsie, you have legacy housing that if converted, at a sale price of $150 to $200 would be vastly more affordable to some of these groups than traditional single-family homes. So what I haven't heard a lot about is how we reevaluate those processes and make them less costly so that we can start to see some of those conversions take place.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. I think we need an entire toolkit with hopefully like 200 ideas in it, and that is certainly a great one. I know we have several habitats that we're working with. Oh, the question was about converting the options, and that there haven't been that many co-op and condo conversions, and that by making apartments available, you would then be reducing the sales price. And so how do we do more of that? And we do have some partners here that are doing that, and Habitat for Humanity in Newburgh specifically that focuses on home ownership. You're going to hear from Habitat of Humanity from Columbia County later today.
Okay, let's do one more.
Hi, I'm a sociologist, professor at school involved and have been acting in rental taxes for a while. And there was legislation passed at the local level to cause eviction, things like that. And of course, it got, there were lawsuits and everything. And then we're trying to get that passed at the state level. We have not had success. We're going to have only getting another program. But there is legislation out there. Purchase Act, which goes along with what you just said about condos, so that they can get some help. Because most tenants can't afford, even if they're converted, to be able to pay for it. And so I'm just wondering if there's any discussion among your groups about legislation and trying to get state level legislation passed that would help some of this stuff. Because, I agree with you guys are awesome and everything you said, but in the meantime, we're talking about saving space, building new housing, which we need to do both. But there's people who are about to be homeless and who've been evicted and who are homeless and couch surfing, who need help now.
So our project is.
Can you rephrase the question a little, Steve?
There's an urgency now. There have been policy proposals around things like no-cause eviction and other things to address people who are in extreme situations in the moment. And are we thinking about policy proposals to try to address those and other issues? Our project has been about bringing these two sectors together, about building the relationships and trust so they can be mutually supportive. One of the first things, or in the first phase of our work, we did was create a number of policy ideas that we felt warranted further exploration. We are now created a public policy subgroup of ours that is beginning to develop those, and for the very first time, and we think this will be powerful, having conservation and affordable housing groups together go meet with elected officials to talk about these issues in a unified way. And the key is going to be what are the specific policy proposals that make the most sense and can be most effective through this mechanism.
I guess, if you don't mind, I'll just provide one quick example. So we just worked on a project to rewrite the region's economic development strategic plan, and there's this big focus on adaptive reuse. A lot of the funding for adaptive reuse will only fund housing if there's a commercial element with it. Yet we have vacancy rates in our downtowns that don't really require us to create additional commercial space. So there's been a lot of pressure put on the state to follow that priority of adaptive reuse in a housing-only kind of way, if that's where the demand is now, because the potential, and Rebecca mentioned this in her remarks, the potential for adaptive reuse in our region is huge. Don't just think about those infill lots downtown or those buildings that have been vacant for a long time. Every single one of our counties has a dead mall with a parking lot that's never going to be more than 10% full ever again, ever, right? So there are a lot of these places that have already been built upon that could be reimagined. If we can loosen up that money to allow for more housing with the commercial piece as sort of an ancillary use instead of the main focus, that's a state policy that we can attack, and there's more like that are out there.
Thank you all for such a great overview.